It is now my pleasure to introduce Miriam. Miriam, please help me with your last name. Zadie. So easy peasy. Okay. So Miriam Zadie, who will be presenting on the topic Healing Through Connection, a workshop on community and trauma. Miriam Zadie is a dedicated professional with a strong commitment to community service, with a background in community development, program management, and counseling. Miriam is passionate about addressing the unique needs of individuals, groups, and organizations within the community. Come on up, Miriam. As a side note, I want to say that a few of us had the opportunity to see Miriam present a number of months ago at a Gatehouse event, and we were completely blown away by what she had to say and present and just who you were as a person. So we definitely are excited to have you here and joining us today. So welcome, Miriam.
I do apologize for the state of my voice. I've been unfortunately ill for the last 2 weeks, so if you can't hear me, please let me know. Is my slides on? Not yet. Is it working? Not yet. Oh, okay. Everybody enjoyed the coffee and the great bakery stuff? Yes? I'll just awkwardly stand here while we wait.
You can have a stand-up comedy routine?
I mean, I can always, start spilling some jokes, but then that would take away from what we're talking about. Oh, am I good? Okay, great. Yay. We're great. Okay, thank you. Okay, so I really appreciate being here, and today's topic that I'm going to be speaking about is connection through community and through the lens of trauma. And the reason why, and I apologize, I have a cough drop in my mouth as well, so I don't start coughing in the middle of this presentation. The reason why this topic is really, really important to me as well as to the work that I do is because when we're talking with individuals who have experienced trauma, we don't look at just the individual through their own specific lens. We also have to look at the individual through the culture that they're a part of, the community that they grow up in, and also the communities that they identify with. And I'm going to go into a little bit of detail later on in terms of what a protective as well as risk factors within being a part of a community actually looks like. Quite a few topics to cover today, but culture is a very significant and very important part of how we respond to and perceive trauma. And the reason why I wanted to focus on the lens of culture is because we are all part of a variety of different cultures. How we identify with, whether it is our ethnic upbringing, our religious upbringing, even things that we're interested in, whether you are into video games or sci-fi, those are all part of cultures that we identify with. And knowing and understanding an individual through the lens of their culture helps us understand the role that trauma has played in their life, as well as how we can manage and deal with the traumatic events that they have gone through. When we are working with individuals who've gone through traumatic events, we also want to understand cultural sensitivity. So having an in-depth knowledge of a variety of cultures and how we address those cultures will help us understand how to deal with these individuals. Okay, it is working great. So when we're talking about a traumatic event, what we're really talking about is how do I put this? So I'm going to give an example, actually. I think that's a lot easier to tell a story. So storytelling is a really great example of how we talk and deal with trauma. Oftentimes when we're dealing with trauma, what we're doing is we are burying our emotions. And what we're doing is we're actually focusing on the event as a story, rather than it being something that happened to us, and focusing more on it being something that happened to somebody else. So for example, two people who have experienced a car accident will have a very different story to tell. One person may be traumatized versus the other person may not be traumatized. And the way that we understand how this person is dealing with their trauma is to understand the cultural implications that they have and how they utilize their own culture to explain the story of the trauma that they have gone through. When we're talking about how we express our trauma, what we're really talking about is the language, the words, and also like the way that we are feeling trauma in our physical bodies, as well as how we're experiencing trauma in our culture, as well as the communities that we are a part of. And the reason why I wanted to focus on communities specifically is because we, as a group of people, not only have a physical community that we identify with, but also we have a community that we identify with in all aspects of our identity. And it's really, really important for us to understand the systemic layers that actually exist when we're dealing with these communities and the ways that we deal with trauma. So how does trauma impact an individual? I mean, that's a very tough question to answer, but essentially, culture can influence a way of a person, an individual dealing with trauma. So for example, one of the topics that is very prevalent in my culture and my community is abortion. And this is also something that is prevalent and a very complicated concept in other people's culture. And so one person dealing with abortion may be a culturally appropriate topic to talk about versus another person who has a different identity. It may be a very challenging topic to talk about. And what we need to understand and what we need to recognize is that when we're talking about very sensitive topics like abortion, like sexual assault, like rape, like any variety of traumas, we have to recognize that a person's individual perception is going to be shaped by the community that they're a part of. And so when we are dealing with individuals, it isn't just important to look at the event and project our own biases onto this event. It is also equally important to understand the individual and how that individual has perceived their own trauma in the words that they're using. When we're talking about community, we're also talking about the role that community plays in how we express our traumas. There are a variety of traumas that people have gone through that are not talked about, that are not discussed. And that's because they're still stigmatized. There are still biases that exist. So for example, mental health is a really big topic that a lot of communities still do not have conversations around. We talked about sexual assault just very briefly, but sexual assault is also a topic that people do not talk about. A lot of individuals who come into my practice and the people that I work with, as well as the organizations that I work with, there's a lot of hush-hush when it comes to talking about these kind of conversations. There's a lot of, we don't talk about it. This never happened. We just keep it within the family. Nobody else needs to know. Those are the words that kind of get expressed very consistently throughout discussions of what actually happened. I worked with an individual who was married for a few years, about 5 years or so, and this person identified as a male. He identified as a man, and it took him about 2.5 years to actually tell me that he was sexually assaulted by his wife, that he was raped by his wife, and he could not stay in this relationship, and he could not remain married, and he had to leave. And he was actually stigmatized by his family and his community because he left what seemed to be a perfectly healthy relationship. And when it took him 2.5 years to actually find the words to describe what happened, and it was so heartbreaking to see his reaction. And when we're talking about a person who identifies as a male, men tend not to talk about their emotions. Men tend to focus on just the logic of what happened. And it took us a really long time to develop a sense of safety, to develop a sense of trust where he could open up and actually describe to me what had happened. And I was the only person, and I'm still the only person that he has ever told. But this gentleman, what happened was he went on to leave his marriage and not leave his community, but talk about his challenges in a way that was not individualized. He was talking about it in a way that was not personified. It was not him that was describing this. He was talking about it in changing genders and talking about it in a way that other people could be educated. But he still wasn't able to say, hey, this is what happened to me. And when we belong to a particular community, and we may all know various communities that we belong to in which certain topics are stigmatized, what we have to recognize is that we are in positions of authority and power, and we have the ability to actually break those barriers down. And being in positions of power and authority, we have the ability to find and utilize words and language that can actually address what the challenge is. Men do not talk about their emotions. Men do not talk about sexual assault. Men do not talk about abuse. And we need to be able to speak about these things. And so the role of community, no matter what community you're part of, is to understand and identify what role you play in that community, what role you play in perceiving and providing support from a cultural lens, and how you can continue to support individuals who have gone through traumatic events. However, being a part of a community, there's also risk factors that are associated, and this is a very important thing to understand. So I did mention that this gentleman that I spoke about, being a part of the community that he was, had he spoken up about his challenges, his sexual assault, he would have been stigmatized by his community. And so the risk factors that exist is that there are still topics that are stereotyped, biased, and prejudiced. And we need to break those conversations and those barriers down. And so when we understand and identify what the risk factors actually are within the variety of communities that we work with, we're able to have open conversations and communicate the needs of the individual. And the needs of the individual essentially come to what do they need, not just from like the person that they're dealing with, but also what do they need from the community that they belong to. So we can go into a variety of different prejudices and biases that exist, but the truth of the matter is that it doesn't matter what prejudice or bias exists. What are the languages and words that we're using to break apart those prejudices? How are we becoming trauma informed when we're coming into a conversation with a preconceived judgment or notion about what this person went through? Because of how they looked, or because of what culture they're from, or the community that they're a part of. I know I'm a visible Muslim, and so one of the things that I often had gotten when I was a child was, you are not from this country. You must have been an immigrant. You could not have studied in a university. You must have gone to college. You probably have an arranged marriage. How many children do you have? All preconceived notions and biases that exist. And it's unfortunate that we have these preconceived notions and biases because it does not allow us to get to the root of who that person is and understand them from their core and understand them in the layers and levels of which communities and cultures they're actually a part of. However, communities can also be a very beautiful protective factor, and it can allow us to actually grow and flourish in the way that we identify with those communities. Communities have the power and brilliance to be able to provide connection, safety, and a sense of self. So one of the things that I want to come back to continuously is this notion of safety. How do we promote safety no matter what community or culture you belong to? How do we promote this sense of safety and sense of belonging and open up those dialogues to have people actually feel like the community that they're a part of is helping them, not hindering them? I worked with a woman a few years ago, about 10 years ago, and she had gone through, she was actually married to a police officer. And this woman who was married to a police officer had 2 young children, a boy and a girl, twins, about 7 years old at that time. And every single time she tried to report sexual assault to the police precinct that she was a part of, to try and draft charges against her husband, those charges disappeared. She was not able to actually state what was happening. And so what she did was she stopped, and she had to become very secluded, and she was not able to actually go forth and protect herself. But she was part of mom's groups in her community. She was a part of different cultural groups in her community, and her community banded together to state what is happening is incorrect. She talked to her local priest. She talked to her local civic center. She talked to her local MP, and she said, this is an abuse of power. This is not fair, and I should be able to speak to and speak about what I am going through without having somebody who is in a position of power take that away from me. And so this is how a community can actually band together, depending on what community you are a part of, and how we can actually generate and have these kind of conversations and these dialogues to protect our individuals. And so when we go into when we go into providing protection, I want to go into a couple of very important case studies. And one is, and I did talk about this sexual assault case with this gentleman, but there was a child that I was working with. He was about 10 years old, and this was about 5 years ago. So he's about 15, still working with him. But one of the cases, this is one of the hardest cases that I had to deal with. And this young person, he was Caucasian, and he actually grew up in an African country, and so he already was physically different than his peers. And then when he came here, he had an accent. He looked very different. He felt very different. He felt like he never fit in. And so this child, unfortunately, was very bullied. And so when his parents brought him to me, he was very suicidal, and he was to the point where his behaviors were, I'm going to use the word atrocious, but they were very atrocious. He was angry all the time. He was breaking walls. He was slamming doors. He was using knives. He was cutting himself. And it was a very, very difficult situation. And his parents were at their wits' end. They're like, we need to send him somewhere because we cannot deal with it. And unfortunately, the root of what he was going through was that he did not feel a sense of safety at home. His parents were always like, well, what did you do wrong? What did you say to that young person for them to be bullying you? And there was no understanding of the community that this young person was a part of. And when I talk about a community for this young person, you would think that the community would be exactly the same. They're of the same ethnicity, they're of the same race, they're of the same religion. But no, being a young person, you are also a part of your own community, your own peer group. And we have to recognize the nuances and the levels of that. And we have to recognize that when we're speaking to somebody, no matter who they are, what kind of perceived notions and biases are we bringing to the table? I could have easily said, well, this person is just angry. But was that true? No, it wasn't true at all, because he was responding with anger, and he was angry because nobody was connecting with him on a deeper level. And what we need to do as a society, as a group, as a community, is actually understand how to connect with people on a deeper level. And this leads to what the cycle of generational trauma actually is. And so when we're talking about generational trauma, we're actually talking about the impact of generations and over generations, how trauma has impacted us and our children and our children's children. And so I'll give my own example. So my parents were actually, my father in particular, his father was actually from a war-torn country. And he migrated to Canada when my father was really young. And my grandfather actually he was a well-known businessman in the country that he was in. But when he migrated here, he had nothing. Like very impoverished, they could barely afford a house, moved around a lot. My mother, on the other hand, she was in concentration camps throughout her life. So she was a prisoner of war. And having a person who has gone through a war, prisoner of war, married together, imagine the kind of challenges I have. I'm just kidding. But I developed a sense of anxiety in terms of how I actually deal with my emotional regulation. And I developed a sense of anxiety on how I speak to my parents about my problems. Still exists, by the way. I still struggle with that. But what I recognized is when we're talking to our parents, or in my case, my parents, about what I go through, I have to look at the world from their lens. And they never had anybody to talk to them about their experiences, their trauma, and how to regulate their own emotions. My dad was a very angry person growing up. If I wanted to talk to him, I had to make sure the TV was on, he was calm, and I could not stand in front of the TV to block his view. And that was the only way he would listen to me. And I remember when I got into my master's program, and I was very proud of myself, I told him, he was like, oh yeah, that's great. And that was his level of emotion. And so I had to understand that the trauma that he experienced, the trauma that my grandparents experienced, the trauma that my mother experienced, influenced and shaped who I am today and how I deal with emotions and how my children will deal with emotions and the people around me will deal with emotions. And so I'm not going into genocide, and I'm not going into slavery, and I'm not going into very, very terrible situations that actually change and shape and actually create trauma in individuals. I'm going into simply migration and immigration. Something simple as majority of us are probably all immigrants to a degree. It's a couple of generations down, but we are all immigrants. And we have to understand that that has impacted and shaped how we also deal with our own trauma, how we talk to and connect with people around us and in our communities. And so what we have to recognize is that every level of our own family and the levels below us of our own children and the people that we connect with are also going to be equally shaped by how we deal with our own traumatic responses. And so what that means is we need to learn to build resilience in our communities. And what we need to do is actually connect with a variety of people in certain communities that can have an impact on individuals. I'm talking about connecting with local priests, if you're identifying as like a community leader, MPs, school teachers, anything and anyone that can actually have a focus or understanding of who you are as a person and have open conversations about the kind of dialogue that we all need to be having. Once we're all speaking the same language and once we all understand that each of us are going through individual and very unique traumas, we can actually open the door to actually creating change. When we're dealing with our young children who are in school and are bullies or have behavioral issues, we can actually open the door to have conversations with not only their teachers and their school counselors, but their parents and their coaches and any other programs that they may be a part of to actually create a plan for these individuals who are going through a challenging time and are not able to utilize the right words to express what they're actually going through. What we need to do is be able to tap into the various networks that actually exist to be able to create a positive change. And what ends up happening is once we build that resilience, we actually create trauma-informed communities. And when we create trauma-informed communities, what we're really doing is we're creating stronger groups of people who are able to continue these dialogues and are actually able to create an impact and impart positive change. And one of the things that I have done in my own private practice is actually create a risk assessment that looks at the high, medium, and low risks of individuals when they come in to see me for therapy. So just a general question. What can you identify as something that would be a high risk? Any takers? Yes. Isolation, absolutely. You had your... No safe living environment, absolutely. Anybody else?
Suicide be part of that?
Suicide
ideation.
Suicide ideation, absolutely. So these are all things that could contribute to a high risk. And so when I created this risk assessment, what I did was, it's a little cut off, but that's okay. What I did was these are just categories of how we're actually identifying risk. We're looking at access to service. We're looking at language barriers. We're looking at cultural connection. We're looking at gender norms. We're looking at a variety of things that can actually contribute to whether a person has a high risk or does not have a high risk. And one woman that came to me who was looking for shelter, of all things, she came to me and she was like, oh, I don't have any money, but I'm looking for shelter. And she was very calm. I use my hands a lot. I'm so sorry. She was very calm and there was no expression on her face. And when she came to me, some of the questions that I asked her was, do you have access to your IDs? Do you have a copy of your ID, a passport, a PR card, anything, health card? She's like, no, got nothing for me, nothing for my kids. I'm like, all right, no problem. Do you have access to your bank accounts? Do you have a bank account? Have you ever set up one? Oh, my husband took me to set up one when I first arrived in Canada about a couple of years ago. I'm like, oh, all right. Are you working? Yeah, everything goes into that bank account. So you have a bank account. You have no access to it. I wonder who has access to that money. That's a risk. And this woman was a part of a culture in which when a woman gets married, she actually receives jewelry or gold as a part of her, I don't want to say the word dowry, but I'm going to use dowry here, as part of her dowry. And I asked her about that, and I'm like, hey, so just a question. I noticed you're not wearing any wedding rings. Do you have any jewelry? Oh, yeah, my parents gave me like a good chunk of jewelry when I got married. And I'm like, all right, great. Do you know where it is? She's like, no, my mother-in-law took it and she put it somewhere safe. And I'm like, can you find it and access it if you need to? She's like, no, I actually have no clue as to where it is. That was a huge red flag. That shows high risk. And the reason why it shows high risk is that this woman has no sense of safety. And this woman has no sense of where she actually belongs or where she can go. She barely spoke the language. She had no way of actually identifying what was wrong or what was happening inside her home. She didn't have the words for it. In fact, the words that she used was, I cannot pay the person who comes to check my locks at my door. I mean, somebody was coming into her apartment and walking in, and she didn't even know that was wrong. And she didn't have access to a bank account. She had no family here. And so all of those things identify as a high risk. And when we work with individuals who have high risk, what we need to do is actually create a culturally sensitive safety plan. And the reason why I use culturally sensitive is we need to be very careful when we're creating a safety plan with these individuals, the language and the words that we're using. Are we basically telling this woman to leave? Just go to a shelter, everything will be okay. No. We need to impart on her and educate her on what leaving would look like. Taking your kids with you, that's a very important thing that some women don't actually end up doing. They leave their kids at home, and leaving your kids at home means that it's very difficult to access your children afterwards. They don't know that having no access to any kind of ID or identification or bank account could lead to fraud or lead to, unfortunately, situations in which they are now responsible. And so having conversations and creating those culturally sensitive safety plans had us helping this woman leave her home and leave her situation in a way that still kept her safe. And when somebody has a high risk, that's what we need to do. And when somebody is a low risk, what we need to do is identify what could actually lead to a high risk. And then if they are high risk, then create a culturally sensitive safety plan. So it's all about identification and understanding what those risk factors are. And the only way that we're actually able to do that is if we have a conversation and understanding of the communities and cultures that individuals belong to. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. Does anybody have any questions?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Hello. Okay. Okay. Don't usually use one of these. So thank you for your presentation. As a child of immigrant parents, I can relate to some of the statements that you had made. Personally, I finished undergrad. It was challenging. I did it on time. I'm a person with lived experience with navigating a disability. And so disabilities in my family don't exist. You go to special school for that. But that was a really important moment for me. And I asked my dad, are you proud of me? And he said, why? It's your job to go to school. So, and it's exactly this kind of response that I think, it's helpful to know how to respond to. So I just made that statement about myself, and there was a response. And you had made that statement, and I responded in a way where I was nodding, as in like, I get it, kind of like the silent nod. So my question is, what is the best way to respond? Because sometimes when you share something like that, you don't really want people to say, oh, that's so sad, that's so upsetting, that's so angering. And sometimes people don't want like the silent nod. I get it. So I don't know what's helpful for you, or whether you have, I guess, thick skin where you've told this story many times. I guess I came in late for the previous speaker, but what I did catch was that it's really important how we respond as a group.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think the first I want to say that I really appreciate that you shared that with us, and I can't, I've been doing this for a while, so I can't imagine how it is for somebody who may not be sharing or open to sharing parts of their life, and the strength that it actually takes. And in terms of how you actually respond to those kind of things, it's really important to bring it back to you and be like, that's amazing, you finished university. What was your undergraduate in? Yeah.
It was a Bachelor of Health Science.
Oh, fantastic. Are
Yeah.
you doing anything with that? Are you working?
I went on to get a master's after. I'm figuring out my next steps.
Nice.
But yeah, but every step along the way was kind of like, okay, what's next?
Yeah, I totally get that. It's hard to figure out what to actually do. And the way that I responded is not to focus on the disability because it's a part of who you are. It's not to focus on the challenge because it's not something that you essentially want me to focus on. But actually, the point of your story, in my opinion, is to focus on the fact that you finished an undergrad and that's fantastic. And looking at you as an individual rather than you with problems.
Yeah, just to clarify the question though, I think it's unclear for me how we as a group can respond to friends, family, clients that come from families that come from generations of, where you're talking about the cycle of trauma, generational, what was the terminology used?
Generational trauma.
Generational trauma. So those sets of parents may never access support to process that. But what's the most validating action that you can take for the individual? Because it could be extreme one way or the other, where you kind of feel sorry for the client, or you just don't respond because it is what it is. So what's the best response to give to someone who shares about themselves?
It goes back to empowering the individual that's sharing and what is empowering for you. So I don't know you well enough to know what would be empowering for you, but if I was responding to somebody who I have known, it would go back to what is empowering for that individual at the end of the day. And so it even when we're dealing with our friends and we're dealing with our family and we're having these kind of conversations, knowing that you can make space for yourself, knowing that you have the power to exist and you do exist, is a very important piece of knowledge to actually accept within yourself. So you are an individual, you have done many, many things, you have accomplishments and achievements, and it's about when you are imparting that, don't let anybody take that away from you. And it's a really difficult place to kind of get to, and it's a really difficult place to accept, because we always want our dad's proudness, or we want our mom's acceptance, or we want our friends to understand us. But you have, like, and this comes down to how we talk about our problems and how we respond to problems. And the first presentation that we had was amazing in terms of, like, imparting various knowledges of how to have these kind of conversations. And it comes down to, like, meeting the person where they're at and focusing on their strengths.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.